You responded to a text message from your sister, correct? And your response was, hopefully, yourself, correct?
Yes.
Who's she?
The defendant.
Miss Reed?
Correct.
You literally said that you hoped that Karen Reed, the subject of your investigation, the woman sitting to my left, about 7 feet from me, that she would just die, correct?
The figure of speech.
How far would you go to protect someone you love? And what if that love turned deadly? Today, we're diving into a case that raises these chilling questions. A case that has shocked a community and left many wondering. Was this a tragic accident or something far more sinister? Building the context. In the early hours of January 29, 2022, a quiet town in Massachusetts became the center of a tragedy that would soon grip the nation. John O'Keefe, a respected Boston police officer, was found unresponsive outside a home in Canton. The night before, he had been out with friends, enjoying what seemed to be a regular Friday night. But by morning, everything had changed. John O'Keefe was discovered lying in the snow, his body battered, his life hanging by a thread. It was a frigid winter night, the kind that bites through layers of clothing and chills you to the bone. O'Keefe's injuries were severe, and it wasn't long before the focus of the investigation turned to his girlfriend, Karen Reed. Karen Reed and John O'Keefe had been in a relationship for some time. By all accounts, they were a loving couple, but like any relationship, theirs wasn't without its challenges. Karen, a well-respected educator, and John, a dedicated police officer, seemed to be the perfect match. But behind closed doors, their relationship had its struggles that would come to light in the wake of John's tragic death. The night of the incident. Let's rewind to that fateful night, January 28, 2022. Karen Reed and John O'Keefe had plans to spend the evening together, starting with a visit to a few local bars in the Canton area. It was a typical Friday night for the couple, who often enjoyed winding down after a long week with drinks and good company. But this night, what began as a casual outing with friends would soon spiral into tragedy. The night started off innocuously enough. Karen and John visited a couple of bars, including a local favorite, where they met up with friends and colleagues. Witnesses described the couple as being in good spirits, laughing, talking, and enjoying each other's company. John, a well-liked and respected Boston police officer, seemed relaxed and happy. Karen, a schoolteacher known for her dedication to her students, appeared to be enjoying the evening as well. As the night progressed, the group decided to continue the party at a house in Canton, owned by a fellow officer. The details of what happened next are where the story takes a dark turn. According to Karen, she and John drove together to the house. It was already late, around midnight, when they arrived. Karen later told investigators that she dropped John off in front of the house, watching as he walked toward the front door before she drove away. She assumed John would spend the night there, as he was known to do on occasion after late nights out. But as the hours ticked by, the narrative of that night grew murkier. John never made it inside the house. Instead, sometime between when Karen left and the early morning hours, he ended up outside, lying in the snow. His injuries were severe, multiple abrasions and lacerations to his head and body, injuries that would ultimately prove fatal. The question that haunts this case is simple yet profoundly disturbing. How did John end up in that state? Before we go into more detail, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update on this case and other true crime stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Now, Karen claims she had no idea anything was wrong until the next morning when she received a call from a friend who informed her that John had been found outside the house, gravely injured. Panicked and confused, Karen rushed to the scene, only to find a flurry of emergency responders and police officers already there. The scene was chaotic. Snow continued to fall, covering the evidence and complicating the investigation. John was rushed to a nearby hospital, but despite the best efforts of medical professionals, he was pronounced dead. As investigators began to piece together the timeline, inconsistencies and troubling details began to emerge. For starters, John's body was found near the driveway, close to where Karen claimed to have dropped him off. But the snow around him was undisturbed, leading to questions about how long he had been lying there and whether he had been moved. Even more concerning were the injuries themselves. John's wounds were consistent with being struck by a vehicle, specifically on the right side of his body. This detail immediately raised suspicions about whether Karen might have accidentally hit John with her SUV as she was leaving the house. Could it have been a tragic accident, one that she wasn't even aware of? Or was there something more intentional, more sinister at play? Another detail that caught investigators' attention was Karen's behavior the morning after the incident. When she arrived at the scene, she seemed genuinely distraught, but there were conflicting accounts of her demeanor. Some witnesses described her as being in shock, while others noted that she seemed unusually calm given the circumstances. As police delved deeper into the case, they also examined the couple's relationship. While Karen and John were generally seen as a loving couple, there were rumors of tension between them, disagreements and arguments that, while not uncommon in relationships, took on a new light in the wake of John's death. The investigation also revealed that Karen had been drinking that night, raising questions about her level of intoxication and whether it could have impaired her judgment or her ability to remember exactly what happened. Toxicology reports would later confirm that both Karen and John had alcohol in their systems, but the exact levels and their impact on the events of that night remain a point of contention. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, one possibility loomed large. Could Karen have hit John with her car in a tragic accident as she was leaving the house? Perhaps she didn't see him, or maybe he slipped in the snow and fell into the path of her vehicle. It's a plausible scenario, one that might explain the injuries and the lack of any sign of struggle or foul play. But if this were the case, why didn't Karen notice? How could she have driven away without realizing what had happened? These questions have plagued investigators, the public, and Karen herself as the case has continued to unfold. The events of that night are shrouded in uncertainty, with each detail raising more questions than answers. What we do know is that a night of fun and friendship ended in unimaginable tragedy, leaving a community in shock and a woman fighting for her freedom in the face of serious criminal charges. Transition to the investigation. As the investigation deepened, the focus on Karen Reed intensified. Investigators combed through phone records, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed the physical evidence in an attempt to determine the truth. But as they dug deeper, the story only became more complex, leading to a series of twists and turns that no one could have predicted. The defense's argument. Karen's lawyers argue that the evidence doesn't add up. They claim that John's injuries could have been caused by someone else, that perhaps another individual was involved in what happened that night. They point to inconsistencies in the timeline, suggesting that John's death might not have been as straightforward as it seems. One of the key pieces of evidence is the snow. The night John was found, the snow was thick, fresh, and undisturbed, except for the area around his body. This detail has raised questions about whether John was placed there after he was injured, and if so, by whom. Karen's defense also points to her character, describing her as a loving, caring individual who would never intentionally harm anyone, let alone the man she loved. They argue that the prosecution's case is built on circumstantial evidence, and that the truth of what happened that night is far more complex than it appears. Public reaction and media coverage. As the case has unfolded, public opinion has been divided. Some see Karen as a victim of a tragic accident, while others believe she's hiding something. The media coverage has only fueled the fire, with headlines that alternately paint her as a grieving girlfriend or a cold-blooded killer. The community where Karen and John lived has also been deeply affected. Friends, family, and neighbors have been pulled into the fray, with some rallying to Karen's defense and others demanding justice for John. The case has become a lightning rod for debate, not just about the facts of that night, but about the nature of love, trust, and betrayal. The legal battle. As the investigation unfolded, the legal battle surrounding Karen Reed's case became a focal point of intense scrutiny and public interest. The charges against Karen were severe: second-degree murder, vehicular manslaughter, and leaving the scene of an accident. Each charge carried heavy implications, not just for Karen's future, but for the narrative of what truly happened on that fateful night. The prosecution's case. The prosecution was resolute in their belief that Karen Reed was responsible for John O'Keefe's death. They argued that the evidence pointed clearly to a scenario in which Karen, after a night of drinking, accidentally struck John with her vehicle as she was leaving the party. According to their theory, Karen was either unaware of what she had done due to her intoxicated state or, worse, she realized it and panicked, driving away without calling for help. Central to the prosecution's case was the forensic evidence. The injuries sustained by John O'Keefe were consistent with being struck by a vehicle. His right side bore the brunt of the impact, injuries that could be explained by the trajectory of a car moving in reverse. The damage to Karen's SUV also seemed to align with this narrative. A cracked taillight and a dent in the rear of the vehicle were highlighted as key pieces of physical evidence supporting the prosecution's argument. The timeline was another crucial element. The prosecution constructed a detailed timeline based on phone records, surveillance footage, and witness testimonies. According to this timeline, Karen left the party around 12:30 a.m. John was discovered hours later, still outside in the freezing cold, his injuries indicating he had been struck shortly after Karen's departure. The prosecution contended that the short window of time between Karen leaving and John being found made it highly unlikely that anyone else could have been involved. They also focused on Karen's behavior following the incident. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who was either in denial or attempting to cover up her actions. They pointed to her delay in realizing John was missing and the fact that she didn't immediately return to the house or call 911 as evidence of her culpability. To bolster their case, the prosecution called on expert witnesses, including forensic pathologists and accident reconstruction specialists. These experts testified that John's injuries were consistent with being struck by a vehicle and that the damage to Karen's SUV could not be easily dismissed as coincidental. They argued that the pattern of injuries and the evidence from the scene all pointed to Karen as the driver responsible for John's death. The defense's strategy. Karen Reed's defense team, however, was determined to challenge every aspect of the prosecution's case. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial at best, and that the prosecution's narrative was riddled with inconsistencies and unanswered questions. One of the central pillars of the defense's strategy was to cast doubt on the timeline. They suggested that the prosecution's timeline was too rigid, ignoring the possibility that something else might have occurred after Karen left the scene. The defense proposed that someone else could have been involved, perhaps someone at the party or another individual who arrived later. This alternative theory was designed to introduce reasonable doubt, suggesting that the prosecution's version of events was not the only possible explanation. The defense also attacked the forensic evidence, particularly the interpretation of John's injuries. They brought in their own experts to testify that while John's injuries could be consistent with being hit by a car, they were not definitive proof of it. They argued that John could have sustained the injuries in another way, perhaps by slipping on the ice or being involved in a different type of accident. This argument was crucial in undermining the prosecution's assertion that Karen's vehicle was the cause of John's death. Another key aspect of the defense's case was Karen's character. They portrayed her as a dedicated teacher, a loving partner, and a respected member of the community who had no history of violent behavior or reckless driving. They argued that it was entirely out of character for Karen to have acted as the prosecution suggested. This character defense was aimed at humanizing Karen in the eyes of the jury, making it harder for them to believe she could have committed such a heinous act. The defense also focused on the idea that Karen was in shock and deeply traumatized by the events of that night, which could explain her seemingly strange behavior in the hours and days following John's death. They suggested that her actions were not those of a guilty person, but rather someone overwhelmed by grief and confusion. Key testimonies and evidence. Throughout the trial, both sides presented a barrage of testimonies and evidence, each aiming to sway the jury. Key testimonies came from friends who were with Karen and John that night, some of whom provided conflicting accounts of Karen's state of mind and behavior. One of the most pivotal moments in the trial was the testimony of the medical examiner who conducted John O'Keefe's autopsy. The examiner confirmed that John's injuries were consistent with being hit by a car, but under cross-examination, the defense was able to extract a concession that the injuries could also have been caused by other means. This testimony left the door open for the defense's argument that another scenario could have led to John's death. Another significant point of contention was the surveillance footage from the bars and the house where the party took place. While the footage showed Karen and John together earlier in the night, there were gaps in the timeline, particularly around the crucial moments when John was last seen alive. The defense argued that these gaps raised doubts about the prosecution's narrative. while the prosecution maintained that the available footage supported their case. The emotional toll. The trial was emotionally charged, with both sides presenting their cases passionately. Karen herself took the stand, a risky move in any trial. During her testimony, she broke down multiple times, expressing her love for John and her deep sorrow over his death. She maintained her innocence, insisting that she would never have knowingly left John in such a vulnerable state. The jury was visibly affected by the emotional weight of the case. They were tasked with not only sifting through the complex forensic and circumstantial evidence, but also grappling with the human element, the tragic loss of a life and the potential ruin of another. Public perception and media influence. Outside the courtroom, the case was a media sensation. Headlines often painted Karen in starkly different lights, depending on the outlet. Some portrayed her as a grieving girlfriend caught up in a tragic accident, while others depicted her as a reckless driver who let her carelessness lead to a fatal outcome. The public was similarly divided, with some sympathizing with Karen and others calling for justice for John O'Keefe. The media coverage influenced public perception, and it's possible that it also had an impact on the jury. The intense scrutiny and the often sensationalized reporting added an additional layer of pressure to an already complicated legal battle. The jury's deliberation. As the trial came to a close, the jury was left with the difficult task of determining Karen Reed's fate. They had to weigh the prosecution's narrative of a tragic yet criminal act against the defense's arguments of reasonable doubt and alternative possibilities. The deliberation was long and fraught with tension, as the jury grappled with the conflicting evidence and the emotional testimonies they had heard. The verdict. The outcome of the trial, whether Karen would be found guilty of murder or cleared of the charges, would have a profound impact on everyone involved. For the O'Keefe family, justice for John was paramount. For Karen, her future, her reputation, and her freedom were all on the line. And for the community, the trial represented a moment of reckoning, forcing them to confront difficult truths about love, loyalty, and the potential for darkness in even the most seemingly stable relationships. Conclusion. As the legal proceedings continue, one thing is certain. The truth of what happened on that cold January night remains shrouded in mystery. For now, we can only speculate, analyze the evidence, and wait for the final verdict. If you found this case as intriguing as we did, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Karen Reed is guilty, or could there be more to the story? And with that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.